wooden cart rattled over broken stones as Elira gripped its edges with white knuckles, her heart slamming against her ribs. Ahead, the mountain fortress rose like a black tooth against the gray sky, and every step closer felt like a step toward her own grave. She had heard the stories since she was a child, whispered around fires late at night. Somewhere inside that fortress lived a creature the villagers called the Beast, a thing so terrible that no one who entered its chamber ever came out the same. Some said it had claws longer than knives. Some said it howled so loud that the mountains themselves trembled. And now, because her name had been drawn from a wooden box in the village square, she was being taken straight to it. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, pale and thin from sickness, tears sliding down her cheeks as the guards pulled Elira away that morning. There had been no time for a proper goodbye, no time to say all the things she wanted to say, just a hurried embrace, a whispered blessing, and then rough hands guiding her into the cart before she could even catch her breath. She pressed her palm against her chest now, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself that this was simply another cruel chapter in a story that had never been kind to her family. The guards who rode alongside the cart said nothing. Their faces were carved from stone, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if looking at her might curse them somehow. Elira had tried speaking to one of them earlier, asking simple questions about where exactly she was being taken, and what would happen once she arrived, but he had only shaken his head and looked away. The silence was almost worse than an answer. It let her imagination run wild, painting pictures of teeth and shadows and things she did not want to see. As the cart climbed higher along the narrow mountain path, the air grew colder, sharper, biting at her exposed skin. Below, she could see her village shrinking into a cluster of small brown roofs, the fields around it turning into patches of green and gold. She wondered if she would ever see it again. She wondered if her mother would survive without her there to care for her, to bring her the herbs and medicines she needed every single day. The thought made her chest tighten painfully, and she forced herself to look forward instead, toward the fortress that grew larger and more menacing with every passing minute. By the time the cart reached the towering iron gates, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, almost as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. The gates groaned open with a sound like a wounded animal, and Elira felt her stomach twist into knots. 2 new guards emerged from the shadows within, taller and broader than the ones who had escorted her, their armor darker, their expressions even more unreadable. They did not speak a single word to her. One of them simply gestured for her to step down from the cart, and when she hesitated, the other took her arm with a grip that was firm but not cruel, guiding her forward whether she wanted to go or not. Inside the fortress walls, everything felt colder and older than she had imagined. Torches lined the stone corridors, their flames flickering wildly as if disturbed by a wind she could not feel. The floors were smooth from centuries of footsteps, and strange carvings decorated the walls, images of wolves and moons and figures she did not recognize. She tried to memorize the path they were taking, some instinct telling her that knowing the way out might matter one day, but the guards moved quickly, turning corner after corner, until she had completely lost track of direction. Finally, they stopped before a massive door, made of dark wood, reinforced with iron bands. It looked ancient, older than anything else she had seen so far, and there was something about it that made her skin crawl even before it opened. One of the guards produced a heavy key and turned it in the lock, with a groan of metal that echoed down the empty corridor. The door swung open slowly, revealing a large stone chamber lit only by a single torch mounted on the far wall. "Inside," the guard said, his voice low and rough, the first word either of them had spoken since she arrived. Elira's legs felt frozen, refusing to move, but the guard's grip on her arm left her no choice. She stumbled forward into the chamber, and before she could turn around, the heavy door slammed shut behind her, with a sound so final, it seemed to shake the very stones beneath her feet. She heard the lock turn, the key withdrawn, and then footsteps retreating down the corridor, until silence swallowed everything whole. For a long moment, she simply stood there, trembling, staring at the door that had just sealed her fate. Then slowly, cautiously, she turned to examine the chamber around her. It was larger than she expected, with high stone ceilings that disappeared into darkness above the reach of the torchlight. A large bed sat against one wall, its frame carved from dark wood, covered in furs that looked soft despite the harshness of everything else in the room. A wooden table stood nearby, along with a chair, and in the corner, a stone basin filled with water. It looked less like a prison and more like someone's private quarters, though the thought did nothing to calm the fear pulsing through her veins. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall farthest from the door, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Every creak of the fortress, every distant sound, sent a fresh wave of terror through her body. She thought of the stories again, the ones that spoke of claws and teeth and screams that echoed through these very halls. She wondered how long she had before the creature came for her, and what exactly would happen when it did. Hours seemed to pass, though she had no way of knowing for certain. The torch on the wall burned steadily, casting long shadows that danced and shifted with every flicker of flame. Alira's eyes grew heavy despite her fear, exhaustion from the long journey pulling at her, but she fought against sleep, terrified of what might happen if she let her guard down even for a moment. She thought of her mother, alone now in their small cottage, and she wondered if she would ever get the chance to hold her again. At some point, exhaustion won the battle against fear, and her eyes began to close despite her best efforts. She drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, jolted awake every few minutes by imagined sounds, by the creak of the fortress settling around her. It was during one of these restless moments that she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from somewhere beyond the door. Alira's entire body went rigid. She pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could somehow melt into the stone and disappear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly outside the chamber door. She held her breath, waiting, praying silently that whatever was out there would simply pass by, that this was some mistake, that she would wake up in her own bed and realize this had all been nothing more than a terrible nightmare. But the key turned in the lock, and the heavy door creaked open. Alira's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, unable to bring herself to look, bracing for claws or teeth or whatever horror waited on the other side. When she finally forced her eyes open, what she saw was not what she expected at all. A man stood in the doorway, not a monster, not a creature of nightmares, but a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his ears, and skin that seemed to glow faintly in the torchlight. His eyes, though, were unlike anything she had ever seen. They were a deep, striking gold, almost glowing in the dim light, sharp and intense as they studied her from across the room. She did not move. She could not move. Every instinct told her to run, to scream, to do something, but her body remained frozen against the wall, her eyes locked on this stranger, who had entered what she had believed to be a monster's lair. He said nothing at first. He simply stood there, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her very soul. His gaze moved over her face, her trembling hands, the way she had curled herself into the corner, as if trying to disappear entirely. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that was not quite anger, and not quite kindness either. "You are Alira," he said finally, his voice deep and steady, carrying none of the roughness she had expected from a monster's growl. She managed a small nod, though her voice refused to work. He studied her for a moment longer, his jaw tightening slightly, as if he were holding something back, some words he had decided not to speak. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the door. "Wait," Alira finally managed to whisper, though she was not entirely sure why she wanted him to stay. Perhaps it was simply that the silence and the unknown were worse than whatever this stranger might tell her. "Who are you? Where is the creature? Where is the beast they spoke of?" He paused at the doorway, his back still turned to her, his broad shoulders tense beneath the dark fabric of his clothing. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and she wondered if he had even heard her question. "Rest," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost gentle despite its depth. "No harm will come to you tonight." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, the lock turning once more, sealing her inside the chamber alone, with nothing but her racing thoughts, and 1,000 new questions she had no answers for. Who was that man? Why had he come instead of the monster she had been warned about? And why, despite everything, despite every instinct screaming at her to be terrified, did some small part of her feel strangely, inexplicably safer than she had felt all day? She did not sleep again that night, her mind turning over every second of that brief encounter, searching for answers in the darkness that refused to give her any. The next morning arrived slowly, sunlight creeping through a narrow slit of window high above her that she had not noticed before. Elira had not moved from her spot against the wall the entire night, her body stiff and aching from the cold stone floor beneath her. She listened carefully for any sound beyond the door, any hint of what the day might bring, but the fortress remained eerily silent. Hours passed before she finally heard footsteps again, lighter this time, quicker. The lock turned, and the door opened to reveal not the golden-eyed stranger from the night before, but an older woman carrying a tray of food and a bundle of fresh cloth. The woman's eyes were kind but cautious, and she moved quickly, setting the tray on the wooden table, without meeting Elira's gaze directly. "Please," Elira said softly, desperate for any information at all. "Can you tell me where I am? What is happening to me?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "Eat," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will need your strength." And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she slipped back out of the chamber, the lock turning once more behind her. Elira stared at the tray of food, bread and fruit, and a small portion of meat, along with a cup of water. Despite everything, her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she had not eaten since the previous morning. She forced herself to eat slowly, her mind still racing with questions about the strange man who had visited her, about the fortress that felt more like a maze of secrets than the lair of any monster. As the day wore on, she explored every inch of the chamber she could reach, searching for any weakness, any possible way out, though she found none. The walls were solid stone, the single window far too high and narrow for her to climb through, even if she could reach it. The only way in or out was through that heavy wooden door, locked tight against her. She spent the hours pacing, sitting, standing, her thoughts constantly returning to those piercing gold eyes, and the quiet, measured way the stranger had spoken to her. He had not hurt her. He had not even raised his voice. And yet something about him had felt powerful in a way she could not quite explain, as though the air itself had grown heavier simply from his presence in the room. By the time evening fell again, casting long shadows across the stone floor, Elira found herself listening for those same heavy footsteps, half dreading and half hoping that he would return. When the sound finally came, echoing down the corridor outside, her heart began to race once more, though this time the fear was tangled with something else entirely, something she could not yet name. The door opened, and there he stood again, his golden eyes finding hers immediately across the dim chamber. This time, he stepped further inside, closing the door softly behind him, rather than lingering at the threshold. Elira pressed herself back against the wall instinctively, though she noticed, with some confusion, that her fear was not quite as sharp as it had been the night before. "You did not eat much," he observed, his gaze flicking briefly toward the tray on the table, most of the food still untouched. "I was not very hungry," she lied, unsure why she felt the need to hide even something so small from him. He studied her again, with that same unreadable expression, as if trying to decide something important. "You are frightened," he said finally, not a question, but a simple statement of fact. "Should I not be?" Elira asked, her voice trembling, despite her attempt to sound braver than she felt. "I was told a monster lived in this chamber. I was told I would never leave this place, and yet here you stand, and I do not understand any of it." Something flickered across his face then, something that might have been regret, though it disappeared as quickly as it had come. He did not answer her question directly. Instead, he moved closer to the table, picking up the untouched food and setting it gently back down, as if reconsidering something. "Eat," he said simply, echoing the words of the woman who had visited earlier. "You will need your strength for whatever comes next." "Whatever comes next," Elira repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean? What is going to happen to me?" He turned to face her fully then, his golden eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, she thought he might finally answer her, might finally explain everything that had brought her to this strange, cold chamber deep within a fortress she did not understand. But instead, he simply shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he said, his voice low and almost gentle. "It is not safe for you to know everything yet, but I promise you this, no harm will come to you while you remain within these walls." Before she could ask anything further, he turned and left the chamber once more, the door closing softly behind him, the lock turning with its familiar, final click. Elira sat alone in the flickering torchlight, staring at the door, her mind spinning with questions that seemed to multiply with every passing hour, rather than find any answers at all. She thought about his words long into the night, turning them over again and again in her mind. He had promised her safety, and yet everything about this place, the silence, the secrecy, the way everyone seemed to avoid her questions, told her that something far larger than she understood was happening around her. She was trapped in a chamber she had been told belonged to a monster, guarded by a man with eyes like molten gold, who spoke in riddles and refused to explain himself. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and the confusion, a small and dangerous curiosity had begun to grow. She wanted to know who this man truly was. She wanted to understand why he came to her chamber each night, instead of the beast the villagers had warned her about. She wanted to know what waited for her beyond these stone walls, and whether the monster she feared was real at all, or whether the true danger lay somewhere else entirely, hidden behind secrets far deeper than she could yet imagine. As sleep finally began to claim her exhausted body, Elira could not shake the feeling that her arrival at this fortress was only the very beginning of something far larger than herself. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about the world beyond her small village, and about the man with golden eyes who held her fate in his careful, restrained hands. 3 days passed inside the stone chamber, each one blurring into the next, until Elira lost count of the hours, by anything other than the flicker of the torch, and the rise and fall of light through the narrow window above. The golden-eyed stranger returned each evening, always with the same quiet steps, always saying only a few words before leaving again. He brought no explanations, only food, water, and sometimes a fresh blanket when the night grew colder than the last. Elira had begun to notice small things about him that she could not ignore, things that did not match the stories she had grown up hearing about the beast of the mountain fortress. His hands, for one, trembled slightly whenever he set something down near her, as though he were holding back some great effort simply by standing so close. His eyes, though fierce and strange, never once looked at her with hunger or cruelty, only with something that resembled restraint, the way a man might look at a fire he was trying very hard not to touch. And his voice, though deep and commanding, never rose in anger, not even when she pushed him with question after question that he refused to answer. On the 4th night, Elira decided she would not let him leave so easily. When the door creaked open and he stepped inside carrying a tray of food, she rose from her spot on the floor and stood facing him directly, her legs shaking slightly, but her voice steadier than it had been before. "I have been here for days," she said, "and I still do not know your name. I do not know why I am locked in this chamber, or what is expected of me, or when I will be allowed to see my mother again. I have done everything you asked. I have eaten, I have rested, but I cannot keep living in silence." He paused near the table, the tray still in his hands, his golden eyes studying her with the same unreadable intensity as always. For a long moment, she thought he might simply turn and leave again without answering, as he had done so many times before, but instead, he set the tray down slowly and turned to face her fully. "My name is Kale," he said finally, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness of the chamber. It was such a simple thing, a single name, and yet it felt like the first true piece of information she had been given since arriving at the fortress. "Kale," she repeated softly, testing the word on her tongue. "And what are you, Kale? A guard? A prisoner, like me? Or something else entirely?" Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of hesitation that told her she had asked a question far more complicated than she realized. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he seemed to war with himself over how much to reveal. "It is complicated," he said finally, "and it is not safe for you to know everything yet. There are people within these walls who would use any knowledge you have against both of us." "Against both of us," Elira repeated, confusion knitting her brow. "What does that mean? Why would anyone care what I know or do not know? I am nothing more than a village girl sent here as an offering. What danger could I possibly pose to anyone?" Kale's expression darkened slightly, though not with anger directed at her. It was something else, something that looked almost like frustration at circumstances beyond his control. "You are more important than you realize," he said, his voice low. "But that is exactly why I cannot tell you everything just yet. Trust takes time, and there are ears in this fortress that do not belong to friends." Elira wanted to press further. wanted to demand more answers, but something in the way he spoke, the weight behind his words, told her that pushing too hard might close him off completely. Instead, she took a different approach, one she hoped might reveal more without forcing him into a corner. "The guards outside," she said carefully. "They spoke of a beast, a monster that devours anyone unlucky enough to be sent here. Is that you they were speaking of?" For the first time since she had met him, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "The stories serve a purpose," he said simply. "Sometimes, fear is a better guard than any locked door." "So the monster is not real," Illyra said slowly, piecing together the implications of his words. "It was never real at all. It was simply a story, meant to frighten people away from this chamber." Cale did not confirm or deny her words directly, but the way his gaze shifted, the way he seemed almost relieved that she had reached this conclusion on her own, told her enough. She felt a strange mixture of emotions then, relief that there was no literal monster waiting to devour her, but also a deepening confusion about why such elaborate lies would be necessary to protect a single chamber deep within a fortress. "If there is no monster," she said, her voice growing steadier with newfound confidence, "then why keep me locked away at all? Why not simply explain the truth and let me understand what is truly happening?" Cale's expression grew serious again, the brief warmth from moments before fading into something more guarded. "Because the truth would put you in greater danger than any story ever could," he said. "There are those who would see you harmed the moment they learn certain things. For now, the safest place for you is exactly where you are, hidden behind rumors that keep the wrong people away." Illyra studied him carefully, trying to read past the careful walls he seemed to have built around himself. "Who are these people you speak of?" she asked. "Who would want to harm me, and why?" He was silent for a long moment, his golden eyes distant, as if considering how much more he could safely reveal. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "There are those within these walls who do not wish for peace between your people and mine. My presence here, my protection of you, threatens plans they have been building for a very long time. If they learned who you truly were to me, or rather, who you might become, they would not hesitate to remove you from this world entirely." The words sent a chill through Illyra's body, though they also raised 100 new questions. "Who I might become," she repeated softly. "What do you mean by that?" But Cale only shook his head, the familiar wall rising once more behind his golden eyes. "Not yet," he said. "I know this is difficult for you. I know you deserve answers, more answers than I have given you so far. But please, trust that everything I am doing, every choice I have made since you arrived, has been to keep you safe. That is all I can offer you tonight." Illyra wanted to argue, wanted to demand the full truth right then and there. But something in his tone told her that he had already given her more than he intended to, more than perhaps he was supposed to. She nodded slowly instead, deciding that patience, however difficult, might be the wiser path forward. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me your name, at least. It is a small thing, but it means more than you might realize." Something softened in his expression at her words, and for just a moment, the careful distance between them seemed to shrink slightly. "You are stronger than you know," he said, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. "Most people, sent to this chamber, spend their days weeping and begging for mercy. You have spent yours asking questions and demanding truth. That is a rare kind of courage." Illyra felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly on her face. "Courage or foolishness," she said, managing a small, tired smile. "I have not yet decided which." Cale's lips curved slightly at her words, the closest thing to a genuine smile she had seen from him since her arrival. "Perhaps it is both," he said, "and perhaps that is exactly what this fortress needs right now." Before she could ask him to explain that cryptic statement further, he turned toward the door, as he always did, signaling that their conversation, however revealing, had reached its end for the night. But this time, before leaving, he paused and looked back at her one final time. "Rest well, Illyra," he said. "Tomorrow, I will bring you something more than food. I will bring you a way to pass the time that does not involve staring at these stone walls all day." She did not know what he meant by that, but the promise of something new, something beyond the endless silence and uncertainty, gave her a small flicker of hope she had not expected to feel within these cold walls. As the door closed and the lock turned once more, Elira found herself thinking not of fear, but of the strange, careful man who called himself Cale, and the secrets he seemed to be carrying with the same restraint he showed in everything else he did. That night, sleep came easier than it had since her arrival, though her dreams were filled with golden eyes and unanswered questions, with a fortress full of secrets she was only beginning to uncover, and with the growing certainty that whatever waited for her beyond these walls was far larger and far more dangerous than any simple story of a monster in the mountains could ever explain. The following morning arrived with a change she had not expected. The heavy door opened not at night, but shortly after sunrise, and instead of the older woman who usually brought her meals, it was Cale himself who stepped inside, carrying a small wooden box under one arm, along with the usual tray of food. Elira sat up quickly from where she had been resting on the bed, surprised by his early arrival. "You said tonight," she said, unable to hide her curiosity. "I changed my mind," he said simply, setting the tray down before placing the wooden box on the table beside it. "Some things are better shared in daylight." She approached cautiously, peering into the box as he opened it to reveal a set of carved wooden figures, small animals and simple game pieces resting on a folded cloth board. "What is this?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by the sight of something so ordinary and unexpected within such a strange place. "A game," Cale said, something almost boyish flickering across his usually guarded expression. "My mother taught it to me when I was young. It seemed like something that might help pass the hours without driving either of us mad with silence." Elira could not help the small laugh that escaped her, the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself since arriving at the fortress. "I did not expect the alpha of this fortress," she said, testing the title she had begun to suspect belonged to him, watching his reaction carefully, to enjoy something so simple as a game of carved figures. Cale's expression flickered with surprise, quickly followed by something like reluctant amusement. "So you have figured out more than I gave you credit for," he said, settling into the chair across from her, without confirming or denying the title she had used. "The guards," she said carefully. "The way they avoided looking at you. The way that woman who brings my food seemed almost afraid to speak too loudly near this chamber. It was not difficult to guess that you are someone of great importance here, not simply a guard or a prisoner." He studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his golden eyes as he decided how to respond. Finally, he simply nodded once, a small, careful confirmation that told her everything she needed to know without a single additional word spoken. Elira felt a fresh wave of questions rise within her, but she pushed them down for now, choosing instead to focus on the strange, unexpected gift of an ordinary morning, shared over a simple game within the walls of a place she had once believed would be her tomb. As they played, moving small wooden pieces across the folded cloth board, Elira found herself studying Cale more closely than before. The careful way he moved, the restraint evident in every gesture, the occasional flashes of warmth that broke through his guarded exterior when she said something that surprised or amused him. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever dangers truly lurked within this fortress, she found herself believing, more with every passing hour, that he was not the monster the stories had painted him to be. And as the morning stretched into afternoon, filled with quiet conversation and the soft clack of wooden pieces against the table, Elira allowed herself, just for a little while, to forget the fear that had brought her to this place, and to simply enjoy the strange, unexpected comfort of Cale's company, even as 1,000 unanswered questions continued to linger in the back of her mind, waiting for the day when he would finally be ready to answer them all. A sharp knock on the chamber door broke the peaceful quiet, only moments after Cale had gathered the wooden game pieces back into their box. He rose immediately, his entire posture shifting from the relaxed companion she had spent the morning with, into someone alert and guarded, his golden eyes narrowing toward the door. Elira felt the change in the air instantly, the way tension seemed to fill the stone chamber the moment that knock echoed through it. "Stay here," Cale said quietly, though there was little else she could do trapped within 4 stone walls. He crossed to the door and opened it just enough to speak with whoever waited outside, his broad frame blocking her view of the corridor beyond. She could hear voices, low and urgent, though the words themselves were impossible to make out from where she sat. She strained to listen, catching only fragments, a name she did not recognize, something about the Western Gate, something about a meeting that could not wait. Cale's voice remained steady throughout, though she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the edge of the door a little too tightly. After a few more moments, he stepped back and closed the door, though this time he did not lock it immediately. He turned to face her, his expression carefully composed, but not entirely able to hide the concern flickering beneath the surface. "I must attend to something," he said. "It should not take long." "Is something wrong?" Elira asked, rising from her seat at the table, unable to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. Cale hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share with her. "There are matters within this fortress that require my attention," he said finally. "Nothing you need to worry about." But the way his jaw tightened as he spoke told her otherwise. Before she could press further, he had already turned and left the chamber, though this time, to her surprise, she heard no click of the lock turning behind him. For the first time since her arrival, the door to her chamber remained unlocked. Elira stared at the door for a long moment, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and temptation. Every instinct told her that stepping outside that door without permission could be dangerous, could undo whatever fragile trust had begun to form between herself and Cale. But the curiosity that had been building inside her since the moment she arrived at this fortress proved too strong to ignore entirely. She crossed the room slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the door handle. She told herself she would only look, only peer into the corridor to see where it led, nothing more. But the moment the door creaked open under her careful touch, she found herself stepping fully into the hallway beyond, the stone floor cold beneath her bare feet. The corridor stretched in both directions, torches lining the walls at even intervals, their flames casting flickering shadows across ancient carvings she had only glimpsed briefly on her first arrival. She could hear voices somewhere in the distance, coming from what sounded like a large chamber further down the hall, though the words remained too distant and muffled to understand clearly. Driven by a curiosity she could not quite suppress, Elira crept quietly down the corridor, keeping close to the wall, ready to retreat at the first sign of anyone approaching. The voices grew clearer as she moved closer to a large archway that opened into what appeared to be a grand hall, and she pressed herself against the stone just outside the entrance, listening carefully to the conversation happening within. "Cannot keep her hidden forever," a voice was saying, sharp and impatient, clearly belonging to someone frustrated by whatever discussion was taking place. "The council grows suspicious. They ask why the Alpha spends every evening locked away in that chamber, rather than attending to matters of the pack." "The girl is under my protection," Cale's voice replied, calm but firm, carrying an authority that Elira had not fully heard from him before. "That is all the council needs to understand." "Protection," the first voice repeated, dripping with skepticism. "Is that truly all this is? Or has the great Alpha King grown attached to a human girl sent here as an offering?" Elira's breath caught in her throat at the words. Alpha King. So her suspicions had been correct all along. Cale was not simply a guard or a nobleman within this fortress. He was the ruler of this entire territory, the very figure the villagers had feared and whispered about for generations, though not as the monster they believed him to be, but as something far more powerful and complicated entirely. "My reasons are my own," Cale said, his voice growing colder, carrying a warning that even Elira, standing outside the chamber, could feel in the air. "You would do well to remember your place, Draven." The name struck something in Elira's memory, though she could not place why it felt significant. She pressed closer to the archway, careful to remain hidden in the shadows, straining to hear more of the conversation unfolding within. "My place," the voice belonging to Draven repeated, a dark edge creeping into his tone. "My place is to serve this pack faithfully, cousin, unlike some who seem more concerned with a human girl than with the treaty that keeps our people from war. Have you forgotten what is truly at stake here?" "I have forgotten nothing," Cale replied sharply. "It is you who seems to have forgotten that this treaty exists, to protect both our people and theirs, not to serve whatever ambitions you have been quietly building within this council." A tense silence followed those words, heavy enough that Elira could almost feel it pressing against her from where she hid. Finally, Draven spoke again, his voice quieter now, though no less threatening for its softness. "Be careful, Cale. The council's patience is not infinite, and neither, I suspect, is mine." Footsteps echoed suddenly from within the chamber, moving toward the archway where Elira stood frozen in fear. She barely had time to press herself further into the shadows before a figure emerged from the grand hall, tall and broad, though not quite as imposing as Kale, with sharp features and eyes that held none of the warmth she had come to associate with the man who had been visiting her chamber each night. Draven passed within only a few feet of where she hid, his gaze fixed straight ahead, thankfully too distracted by his own thoughts to notice her presence in the shadows. Elira waited until his footsteps had faded completely down the corridor, before daring to breathe again. Her mind raced with everything she had just overheard. Kale was the Alpha King, ruler of this entire fortress and the lands beyond it, and there were those within his own pack, led by a man named Draven, who saw her presence as a threat, or perhaps worse, as a weakness they might exploit against their own leader. She knew she should return to her chamber immediately, before Kale discovered she had wandered from the safety he had promised her, but something rooted her in place for just a moment longer, some need to understand more before retreating back into the ignorance she had lived with since her arrival. She peered carefully around the edge of the archway, catching sight of Kale still standing within the grand hall, his back to her, his shoulders tense with an anger he had clearly been suppressing during his conversation with Draven. He turned suddenly, as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the distance of the hall. Elira froze, caught, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for whatever reaction might come next. But instead of anger, she saw something closer to alarm cross his features, quickly followed by urgency as he strode toward her. "You should not be out here," he said, his voice low but firm as he reached her, glancing quickly down both directions of the corridor as if checking for anyone else who might have seen her. "I heard everything," Elira said quietly, deciding that honesty, however risky, was better than pretending she had not overheard his conversation. "You are the Alpha King." Kale's expression tightened, though he did not deny it. Instead, he took her gently by the arm and guided her quickly back toward her chamber, his pace brisk enough that she nearly had to jog to keep up with his long strides. Once they were safely back inside and the door was closed behind them, he finally released a long breath, running a hand through his dark hair in a rare moment of visible frustration. "You should not have left the chamber," he said, though there was no real anger in his voice, only concern. "You left the door unlocked," Elira pointed out, though she immediately regretted the accusatory tone, understanding that it had likely been an oversight, born from the urgency of whatever summons had called him away. "I am sorry. I should not have wandered so far. But I could not simply sit here, wondering what was happening beyond these walls." Kale studied her for a long moment, something conflicted behind his golden eyes. Finally he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yes," he said simply. "I am the Alpha King of this territory. I did not tell you sooner because the fewer people who knew certain truths, the safer you would be. And the man I heard you speaking with," Elira said carefully, "Draven, he does not want me here." Kale's jaw tightened at the mention of the name. "Draven is my cousin," he said. "He believes that my protection of you threatens the stability of the treaty between our people, and perhaps he is not entirely wrong to worry. But his concerns run deeper than simple politics. He has ambitions of his own, ambitions that would be far easier to pursue if I were no longer in a position to lead this pack." Elira felt a chill settle over her at his words. "Are you saying he wants to see you removed from power?" "I am saying," Kale replied carefully, "that there are many layers to what is happening within these walls, more than I can fully explain even now. But know this. Whatever Draven's ambitions may be, whatever danger he represents, you are not the cause of it. You have simply become a convenient excuse for grievances that existed long before you arrived at this fortress." Despite his reassurance, Elira could not shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. She had come to this fortress believing herself a sacrifice to a monster, only to discover that the true dangers lurking within these walls were far more complicated, far more human, than any story of claws and teeth could have ever prepared her for. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could not stop wondering exactly what Draven had meant when he suggested that Kale's protection of her went beyond simple duty, and whether there was truth buried within those suspicious words that even Kale himself had not yet been ready to admit. That night, as she lay awake staring at the stone ceiling above her, Elira found herself replaying every word of the conversation she had overheard, searching for answers within the careful, guarded things Kale had told her, and wondering just how deep the danger surrounding her had truly become. Over the days that followed, a quiet rhythm settled between them. though the shadow of Draven's words continued to linger in the back of Alira's mind like a splinter she could not remove. Cale visited each evening, as he had before, but now she noticed things she had missed in the earlier days of her captivity. Small signs of the burden he carried, as leader of an entire pack. The faint shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The way his hand sometimes drifted to his side, as though favoring an old wound. The careful control in every movement, as if he were constantly holding something powerful back from breaking free. One evening, as she helped him set up the wooden game pieces on the table between them, she noticed a fresh mark along his forearm, red and slightly raised, as though he had been recently injured. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched the skin near the wound, drawing his attention immediately. "What happened here?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Cale pulled his arm back slightly, though not with any anger, more with the instinct of someone unused to being fussed over. "It is nothing," he said. "A disagreement during training, with some of the younger wolves. It will heal soon enough." "It looks deeper than a simple training injury," Alira said, studying the mark more carefully despite his attempt to downplay it. Her mother had taught her enough about healing wounds over the years that she recognized the signs of something more serious than he was admitting. "Let me look at it properly." "There is no need," Cale said, though there was a softness in his refusal that told her he was more touched by her concern than he wanted to admit. "Please," Alira said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I may be locked within this chamber, but that does not mean I am helpless. My mother is a healer. She taught me everything she knows before I was taken from our village. Let me at least clean the wound properly." Something shifted in Cale's expression at the mention of her mother, a flicker of understanding passing behind his golden eyes. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he extended his arm toward her, allowing her to examine the injury more closely. She retrieved a small cloth and some water from the basin in the corner, working carefully as she cleaned the wound, her fingers gentle despite the roughness of the fortress around them. "This needed attention days ago," she said, frowning slightly as she worked. "Why did you not have someone tend to it properly?" Cale was quiet for a moment before answering. "There are few within this fortress I trust enough to show weakness in front of," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than usual. "Draven has ears everywhere. Any sign of injury, any hint of vulnerability, becomes ammunition for those seeking to challenge my position." Alira paused in her work, looking up at him with a mixture of sympathy and understanding she had not expected to feel so strongly for a man who, only days earlier, she had believed to be a monster. "That sounds like a lonely way to live," she said softly. Cale's jaw tightened, though he did not deny her words. "It is the price of leadership," he said simply, "one I accepted long ago." "But it does not have to be a price you pay entirely alone," Alira said, surprising herself with the boldness of her own words. "Whatever else may be happening within these walls, whatever danger surrounds us both, you do not have to hide every weakness from everyone around you. Not from me, at least." Something in Cale's expression softened completely then, the careful walls he had built around himself lowering just slightly as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You continue to surprise me, Alira," he said quietly. "Most in your position would have spent these days weeping for their freedom, cursing the fate that brought them here. Instead, you tend to my wounds and offer me comfort I have not received from anyone in a very long time." "Perhaps," Alira said, finishing her work and setting the cloth aside, "I have simply decided that fear alone will not change my circumstances, but perhaps kindness might." Cale reached out then, his hand covering hers where it rested on the table between them, his touch warm despite the coolness of the stone chamber around them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence charged with something neither seemed quite ready to name aloud. Finally, he pulled his hand back, clearing his throat, as though remembering himself. "I should teach you something," he said, his tone shifting to something more practical, though the warmth from moments before lingered in his eyes. "If you are to remain within these walls, there are things about my people you should understand, customs that might help you, should you ever need to navigate this fortress without my protection nearby." Alira nodded eagerly, grateful for anything that might help her understand the world she now found herself trapped within. Over the following hour, Cale explained small details about wolf customs she had never known, the meaning behind certain gestures, the way rank and respect were shown among his people, small signs that might mean the difference between safety and danger if she ever found herself alone among his kind. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked eventually, curiosity getting the better of her. "You said yourself that no harm would come to me while I remained here. Why prepare me for a situation you claim will not happen?" Cale's expression grew serious, the warmth from earlier fading into something more solemn. "Because," he said carefully, "I cannot promise you that nothing will ever go wrong. Draven grows bolder with each passing day, and I fear the situation within this fortress is far more fragile than even I have let myself believe. I would rather you carry knowledge that might protect you, even if it is knowledge I pray you never need to use." The weight of his words settled heavily over Alira, reminding her once again that whatever peace she had begun to find within these walls remained fragile, threatened by forces far beyond her understanding or control. "You truly believe he might try something against you?" she said, not quite a question. "I believe," Cale said slowly, "that ambition, left unchecked for long enough, eventually seeks an opportunity to act, and I fear that opportunity may come sooner than I would like." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the weight of unspoken worries hanging between them, though neither seemed willing to voice their deepest fears aloud. Eventually, Cale rose to leave, as he always did, though this time he paused at the door longer than usual, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Whatever happens," he said finally, "know that everything I have done since your arrival has been to protect you, even when my methods seemed harsh or confusing. I need you to trust that, Alira, more than anything else I could tell you tonight." "I do trust you," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that the words were entirely true. Whatever fear had brought her to this fortress, whatever uncertainty still surrounded her circumstances, she no longer viewed Cale as a captor or a monster, but as someone fighting his own battles, within walls far more dangerous than she had first imagined. After he left, Alira lay awake once more, her mind turning over everything he had taught her, every warning he had given about the fragile state of the fortress around them. She thought of Draven's cold eyes and colder words, of the ambition Cale feared might soon boil over into something far more dangerous than mere political disagreement. And she thought, too, of the warmth in Cale's touch when his hand had covered hers, a warmth that confused her even as it comforted her, in ways she had not expected to feel within these stone walls. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with restless dreams of shadows moving through corridors, of golden eyes watching over her even in her sleep, and of a growing sense that whatever storm was building within this fortress, she had somehow become caught directly within its path, whether she wished to be or not. The following days brought a subtle change to the fortress atmosphere, one that even Alira, confined as she was to her chamber, could sense through the tension in Cale's visits and the hushed, hurried voices she sometimes heard passing outside her door. He came to her less frequently now, his visits shorter, his expression more strained each time he appeared. When she asked what troubled him, he offered only vague reassurances, telling her that matters within the council required more of his attention than usual. One evening, when he arrived far later than his usual hour, his exhaustion was evident in the slight slump of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. Alira rose immediately from where she had been sitting, moving to help him into the chair, before he could even settle himself properly. "You look as though you have not slept in days," she said, concern evident in her voice. "There is much to attend to," Cale admitted, rubbing his temple wearily. "The council grows restless. Draven continues to whisper doubts into ears that should know better than to listen. And beyond these walls, tensions along the border between our territories and the human settlements grow more strained with each passing week. Because of the treaty," Alira said quietly, understanding dawning, as she recalled the fragments of conversation she had overheard between Cale and his cousin. Cale nodded grimly. "The treaty exists because both our peoples nearly destroyed each other in wars that lasted generations before either of us was born," he said. "It is a fragile peace, Alira, built on old wounds and older fears. Draven believes that fragile peace is a weakness rather than a strength, that our people would be better served by asserting dominance rather than maintaining balance. And you disagree," she said, though it was not truly a question. "I have seen what war does to both sides," Cale said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like old grief. "I lost my own father, to a battle that should never have needed to be fought. I will not lead my people back into that same darkness, simply because Draven craves the kind of power that comes from conquest, rather than cooperation." Alira felt a fresh wave of sympathy for the man before her, understanding now the true weight he carried, not simply as a leader responsible for a single pack, but as someone determined to prevent an entire cycle of violence from repeating itself. "You carry a heavy burden," she said softly. "One I would carry gladly," Cale said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her chest tighten, if it meant preventing the kind of suffering that war brings to innocent people on both sides of this conflict. They sat together quietly for a while longer, the weight of his words settling comfortably between them, rather than pressing down with the usual tension of unspoken fears. And as Elira studied the tired but determined man before her, she found herself hoping, more fervently than she had hoped for anything in a long time, that whatever conflict was brewing within these walls would resolve itself, before it could tear apart everything Cale had worked so hard to protect. A commotion outside her chamber door pulled Elira from a light sleep several nights later, the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps echoing through the stone corridor beyond her room. She sat up quickly, her heart already racing before she had even fully registered what had woken her. The voices grew louder, sharper, and among them she recognized a tone she had come to know well over the past weeks, though it carried none of the calm control she associated with Cale. This voice was strained, urgent, almost desperate. She rose from the bed and pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door, straining to make sense of the commotion beyond. She could hear at least 3 distinct voices arguing, though the words remained frustratingly muffled through the thick stone walls. After several long minutes, the voices began to fade, footsteps retreating down the corridor, until silence returned once more to the fortress around her. Elira remained awake for the rest of the night, sleep proving impossible, as she waited anxiously for any further sign of what had disturbed the fortress so late in the evening. When morning finally arrived, it was not the older woman who usually brought her food, nor was it Cale himself, but a young wolf guard she did not recognize, his expression tense as he set the tray down without meeting her eyes. "Please," Elira said, rising quickly from where she had been sitting. "Can you tell me what happened last night? I heard voices, arguing. Is everything well?" The young guard hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door, as though worried someone might overhear him speaking with her. "It is not my place to say," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but the Alpha King is well. That is all I can tell you." Before she could ask anything further, he had already turned and left, the lock clicking shut behind him with unusual haste. Elira spent the following hours pacing the chamber restlessly, her mind conjuring countless possibilities for what might have caused such tension within the fortress overnight. She thought of Draven's cold eyes and colder words, and could not shake the fear that whatever had happened, it was connected somehow to the growing conflict Cale had warned her about. It was not until well past midday that the door finally opened again, and this time it was Cale himself who entered, though his appearance immediately confirmed her worst fears. A fresh cut marked his cheek, and he moved with a stiffness that suggested injuries beyond what she could see. His golden eyes, usually so composed, carried a weariness and tension that made her chest tighten with worry the moment she saw him. "What happened?" she asked immediately, crossing the room to stand before him, her eyes taking in every visible sign of the ordeal he had clearly endured. "An attempt was made on my life last night," Cale said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "During a routine patrol along the northern border, several wolves, loyal to Draven, ambushed my guard, and myself, under the cover of darkness." Elira felt the blood drain from her face at his words. "You could have been killed," she whispered, horror washing over her, as the full weight of the danger surrounding him finally settled in. "I have survived worse," Cale said, though the grim set of his jaw told her this attack had been far more serious than he wanted to admit. "But it confirms what I have feared for weeks now. Draven no longer intends to simply undermine my authority through words and whispers. He has decided to act directly against me." "Then you must do something," Elira said urgently. "You cannot simply wait for him to try again. Surely there are others within your council who remain loyal to you, who would help you stop him before he succeeds in causing greater harm." Cale's expression grew troubled, a heaviness settling over his features that spoke of difficult decisions weighing on his mind. "It is not so simple," he said. "Draven has spent years cultivating support among certain factions within the pack, promising them power and position should he ever ascend to leadership. To move against him directly, without absolute proof of his treachery, risks fracturing the pack entirely, perhaps even sparking the very conflict I have worked so hard to prevent." "But he just tried to kill you," Alira said, disbelief evident in her voice. Surely that alone is proof enough of his intentions. The wolves who attacked us wore no markings, carried no evidence connecting them directly to Draven, Cale said grimly. He is far too careful to leave such an obvious trail. Without undeniable proof, any accusation I make against him risks appearing as nothing more than an attempt to eliminate a political rival, further fueling the very doubts he has been planting among the council for months now. Alira felt a fresh wave of frustration and fear settle over her at the impossible situation Cale now faced. Then what will you do? She asked, her voice quieter now, though no less urgent. Cale was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered the question. I do not yet know, he admitted finally, but I fear that whatever path I choose, the danger surrounding both of us will only continue to grow from here. The weight of his words settled heavily between them, and Alira found herself moving closer without fully deciding to do so, reaching out to gently touch the fresh wound on his cheek, with the same careful attention she had shown his arm days before. Cale did not pull away this time, allowing her the closeness she offered, his golden eyes softening, as he watched her tend to his injury with quiet concentration. You should not have to face this alone, she said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him once before. I have faced greater dangers alone for many years, Cale said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. It is the burden of leadership. Perhaps, Alira said, finishing her careful work and meeting his gaze directly. But that does not mean you must continue facing it entirely without support. Whatever help I can offer, however small it may seem, you have it. I may not be a warrior or a counselor within your pack, but I refuse to simply sit within these walls while danger grows around you. Something shifted in Cale's expression then, a warmth breaking through the weariness and tension that had marked his features since his arrival. He reached up, his hand covering hers where it still rested against his cheek, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. Alira, he said quietly, her name carrying a weight in his voice she had not heard before. I fear I have allowed myself to care for you, far more deeply than circumstances should have permitted. Every danger that surrounds me now threatens you as well, simply because of the bond that has grown between us these past weeks. Her heart raced at his words, understanding fully now the depth of feeling that had been building silently between them since that first night when he had stepped into her chamber, not as the monster she feared, but as a man burdened by responsibilities and dangers far greater than she had first understood. Then let us face those dangers together, she said softly, rather than each of us struggling alone, against threats too large for one person to handle, entirely by themselves. Cale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective flickering behind his golden eyes. If Draven or his allies were to learn the depth of my feelings for you, he said slowly, they would see you as a weakness to exploit, a way to strike at me more effectively than any direct attack could achieve. I cannot allow that to happen. So we continue as we have, Alira said, understanding the careful balance he was trying to maintain, hidden behind the story of a monster and an offering, while the truth between us remains our own secret. For now, Cale agreed, though the reluctance in his voice was evident, until I find a way to expose Draven's treachery beyond any doubt, until I can ensure your safety without question, we must remain careful. I cannot risk losing you to the very dangers I have sworn to protect you from. They remained together for the rest of that afternoon, the careful walls between them lowering further with each passing hour, though the shadow of Draven's ambition and the very real danger it represented continued to hang over every moment they shared. As evening approached and Cale finally rose to leave, tending to whatever duties still awaited him despite his injuries, Alira found herself watching him, with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Draven's ambition might bring to this fortress, she resolved silently that she would not simply remain a passive prisoner, waiting for fate to decide her circumstances. She would find some way to help Cale, some way to protect not just herself, but the man who had shown her, despite every fearful story she had grown up believing, that true monsters rarely wore the faces the stories suggested, and that true courage often came from the most unexpected places imaginable. That night, alone once more within her chamber, Alira began quietly making plans of her own, determined that when the moment finally came, whatever form the coming conflict might take, She would be ready to stand beside Cale, rather than simply waiting behind locked doors for others to determine her fate. The days that followed carried a strange, uneasy quality, as though the entire fortress were holding its breath, in anticipation of something none of its occupants could quite name. Cale visited less frequently now, his time consumed by council meetings and matters of security that kept him away for stretches longer than Alira had grown accustomed to. When he did appear, his exhaustion seemed to deepen with each visit, though he always made an effort to hide the worst of it from her, a gesture she found both touching and frustrating in equal measure. It was during one such visit, nearly a week after the attack along the northern border, that the older woman who usually brought Alira's meals arrived instead, with news that made her blood run cold. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, before she finally spoke in a hushed whisper. "There is talk among the guards," she said quietly, "that Draven has convinced several council members you are not simply an offering under the Alpha's protection, but a spy sent by the human settlements to gather information against our pack." Alira felt her stomach drop at the accusation. "That is not true," she said, her voice tight with disbelief and fear. "I am no spy. I was chosen by lot from my village, just as every offering before me." "I know," the woman said gently, "but truth matters little when fear and ambition work together against it. Draven has always been clever with words, twisting circumstances to serve his own purposes. You must be careful, child, very careful." After the woman left, Alira paced the chamber restlessly, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. If Draven had convinced enough of the council that she posed a genuine threat, it would give him the perfect justification to move against her, and by extension, against Cale himself, for continuing to protect someone accused of such treachery. When Cale finally arrived that evening, later than usual and visibly troubled, Alira wasted no time addressing what she had learned. "I heard what Draven is claiming," she said immediately. "That I am a spy, sent to gather information against your pack." Cale's expression darkened, confirming her fears, even before he spoke. "The accusation was raised formally, before the council today," he admitted, his voice heavy with barely controlled anger. "Draven has presented what he claims is evidence, testimony from guards, who supposedly witnessed you attempting to gather information about our fortress defenses." "That is a lie," Alira said fiercely. "I have done nothing of the sort. The only time I left this chamber was the day I overheard your conversation with Draven himself, and that was simple curiosity, nothing more." "I know," Cale said, though the weight of worry did not lift from his features. "But knowing the truth and proving it to a council, increasingly swayed by Draven's influence, are two very different challenges. He has built his case carefully, presenting false witnesses who claim to have seen things that never happened." "What will happen now?" Alira asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her attempt to remain steady. Cale was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration. "The council has demanded a formal hearing," he said finally. "You will need to answer these accusations directly, before the full assembly of pack leaders. If they find the evidence against you convincing enough, even I may not have the authority to prevent whatever punishment they decide is warranted." The full weight of the danger she now faced settled over Alira like a physical force, pressing down on her chest until she found it difficult to breathe properly. "And if they believe Draven's lies," she said quietly, though she already knew the answer. "I will not allow that to happen," Cale said fiercely, closing the distance between them, and taking her hands in his own, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that spoke of fierce protection, rather than empty reassurance. "Whatever I must do, whatever risks I must take, I will not allow Draven's schemes to harm you. But you said yourself that moving against him without proof risks fracturing your entire pack," Alira said, torn between gratitude for his protection and fear of what it might cost him. "If you defend me too openly, will it not simply confirm the very suspicions Draven has been spreading, that your feelings for me have compromised your judgment as Alpha?" Cale's expression grew troubled, clearly wrestling with the same impossible dilemma she had just voiced aloud. "Perhaps," he admitted reluctantly, "but I cannot simply stand by and allow false accusations to determine your fate. There must be some way to expose the truth without further endangering either of us." They spent the remainder of that evening discussing every possible approach, every angle from which they might counter Draven's carefully constructed lies. Elira suggested that if false witnesses had been presented, there might be inconsistencies in their testimonies that could be exposed through careful questioning. Chaol agreed this was their best hope, though he cautioned that Draven had likely prepared his witnesses thoroughly enough to avoid such obvious pitfalls. As the hour grew late and Chaol finally rose to leave, his expression carried a heaviness that told Elira just how seriously he viewed the threat now facing them both. Before departing, he paused at the door, turning back to face her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever happens at this hearing," he said quietly, "know that I will fight for you with everything I possess, regardless of what it might cost me personally. You have become far more important to me than simple duty or protection. Elira, I need you to understand that, whatever the council decides." The confession, though carefully worded, carried a depth of feeling that left Elira speechless for a moment, her heart racing, with emotions she had been trying to suppress since the moment she first realized the man before her was not the monster she had feared, but someone capable of a depth of care and loyalty she had never expected to find within these cold stone walls. "I understand," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, "and whatever happens, know that I do not regret a single moment I have spent within these walls, difficult as they have sometimes been. Meeting you, understanding the truth behind the stories that brought me here, has changed everything I believed about this fortress and the people within it." Chaol's expression softened completely then, the fierce protectiveness giving way to something gentler, more vulnerable than she had seen from him before. He crossed the room quickly, closing the distance between them, and for a long moment they simply stood together in silence, drawing strength from each other's presence as the weight of the coming hearing pressed down around them both. "Rest if you can," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, we face the council together, and whatever they decide, I promise you this: I will not allow Draven's ambitions to destroy either of us without a fight." After he left, Elira remained standing in the center of the chamber for a long time, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She thought of her mother, waiting alone in their small village, unaware of the danger her daughter now faced within these fortress walls. She thought of Chaol's fierce declaration of care, and the courage it must have taken for a man burdened by so much responsibility to speak such words aloud, despite the danger they represented for them both. And she thought too of Draven's cold, calculating eyes, and the ambition that seemed to drive him toward increasingly desperate measures to secure the power he so clearly craved. Whatever happened tomorrow, she understood now that this conflict had grown far beyond a simple question of her own fate. The very future of Chaol's leadership, and perhaps the fragile peace between their two peoples, now hung in the balance, dependent on whether truth could triumph over the carefully constructed lies Draven had spent months building. Sleep proved nearly impossible that night, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the hearing that awaited her, every question the council might ask, every piece of evidence Draven might present against her. She rehearsed her answers carefully, determined that whatever accusations were leveled against her, she would face them with the same courage Chaol had praised in her since that very first night, when she had dared to demand answers, rather than simply accepting her fate in silence. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the narrow window above her, Elira finally allowed herself a few precious hours of restless sleep, gathering whatever strength she could manage before the trial that awaited her, uncertain whether the truth alone would prove enough to save her from the carefully woven web of lies that Draven had spent so long constructing against her. The great hall of the fortress looked entirely different from what Elira had imagined during the days she spent locked within her chamber. Massive stone pillars rose toward a vaulted ceiling high above, and rows of wolves in formal attire lined both sides of the chamber, their eyes following her every movement, as guards escorted her toward the center of the room. She kept her chin lifted despite the fear churning within her, remembering Chaol's words from the night before, determined to face whatever accusations awaited, with the same courage he had come to admire in her. Chaol sat at the head of the hall upon a raised platform, his expression carefully neutral, though Elira could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair just a little too tightly. Beside him, though positioned slightly lower, sat several council members she did not recognize, their expressions ranging from curious to openly suspicious as they studied her. And near the front of the gathered crowd stood Draven, his sharp features arranged into an expression of concerned solemnity that Elira found utterly unconvincing, given everything she now knew about his true ambitions. Illyra of the border village, announced a stern-looking wolf standing near the platform, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. You stand before this council, accused of gathering information against the pack, under the guise of your role as this year's offering. How do you answer these charges? They are false, Illyra said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. I have done nothing but remain within the chamber where I was placed, save for a single moment, when curiosity led me to wander the corridor outside. I have gathered no information, sought no secrets, and posed no threat to this pack whatsoever. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd at her words, though Draven stepped forward smoothly, his expression carefully composed as he addressed the council directly. With respect, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. I have witnesses who claim otherwise. Guards who observed this girl moving through restricted corridors, asking questions about our fortress defenses, our numbers, our vulnerabilities. Then let these witnesses come forward, Cale said sharply, speaking for the first time since Illyra had entered the hall, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd instantly. Let them testify directly before this council, so that their claims might be properly examined. Draven gestured, and two wolves stepped forward from among the gathered crowd, their expressions carefully blank as they took their places before the council. Illyra studied them closely, searching for any sign of the falsehood she knew must be present in whatever testimony they were about to offer. Tell the council what you witnessed, Draven instructed, his tone smooth and confident. The first guard cleared his throat before speaking, his voice steady, but somehow lacking the natural conviction of genuine memory. I saw the girl near the eastern watchtower, he said, asking one of the younger guards about our patrol schedules and the number of warriors stationed along that section of the wall. Illyra felt a flash of genuine confusion at the accusation, quickly followed by relief, as she realized the lie contained an obvious flaw. I have never been near any watchtower, she said firmly, turning to address the council directly. I have been confined to a single chamber since my arrival, with only one occasion, when I briefly stepped into the corridor, directly outside that room. I do not even know where this eastern watchtower is located within this fortress. A convenient denial, Draven said smoothly, though Illyra noticed a flicker of something uncertain cross his features at her confident response. Perhaps, Cale interjected, his golden eyes sharp as he studied the guard who had just testified, you might describe for the council exactly which chamber housed the offering during the time of this supposed encounter. The guard hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the direct question, his eyes darting briefly toward Draven before he answered. I am not certain of the exact chamber, my lord. I simply recognize the girl by her description. Her description, Cale repeated, his voice growing colder. And who provided you with this description exactly? The guard's composure cracked slightly under the weight of Cale's questioning, and Illyra could see the calculated confidence Draven had built beginning to unravel thread by thread. I was told by another guard, the man stammered, that the offering had been seen near the watchtower, and I simply confirmed what I had already heard. A ripple of uneasy murmuring spread through the gathered council members at this admission, several exchanging glances that suggested growing doubt about the validity of the accusations being presented. Draven's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he quickly stepped forward to address the situation before it could unravel further. A simple misunderstanding of details does not negate the fundamental truth of the accusation, he said smoothly, though his voice carried slightly less confidence than before. I have additional witnesses who can attest to more substantial evidence of this girl's true purpose here. Then let us hear them, Cale said firmly, though I would remind this council that testimony built on second-hand rumor, rather than direct witness, holds little weight in matters as serious as those being alleged here today. Draven gestured again, and a second guard stepped forward, though Illyra noticed this one seemed even more nervous than the first, his eyes darting anxiously around the hall as though searching for some form of reassurance. Speak, Draven instructed, though there was a slight edge to his voice now that had not been present before. I saw papers, the guard said hesitantly, hidden within the offerings chamber. Documents that appeared to contain information about our fortress layout. Papers, Illyra said immediately, unable to hide her disbelief at such an obviously fabricated claim. I have no papers of any kind within my chamber. I cannot even write, having never been taught such skills within my village. This accusation is entirely impossible. The guard's composure faltered visibly at her response, his eyes once again seeking guidance from Draven, who now appeared distinctly uncomfortable with how quickly his carefully constructed case was beginning to crumble under direct scrutiny. "Perhaps," Cale said, rising slowly from his seat, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the hall. "This council would benefit from a thorough search of the chamber in question, to verify once and for all whether these alleged documents actually exist." A murmur of agreement spread through the assembled council members, and even Draven, despite his obvious discomfort, could not reasonably object to such a straightforward proposal without further arousing suspicion about his own motives. "A reasonable suggestion," he said stiffly, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his growing unease. Several guards were dispatched immediately to search Alira's chamber, and the hall fell into an uneasy silence as everyone waited for their return. Alira stood as steadily as she could manage, though her heart continued to race with uncertainty about how this confrontation might ultimately resolve itself. She caught Cale's eye briefly across the distance of the hall, and the quiet confidence she saw reflected there gave her a measure of comfort despite the tension surrounding them both. When the guards finally returned, empty-handed as Alira had known they would be, a fresh wave of murmuring swept through the gathered crowd. "No such documents were found within the chamber," one of the guards reported, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall. Draven's expression tightened further, though he attempted one final effort to salvage his crumbling accusations. "Perhaps she disposed of them before the search could be conducted," he suggested, though even his own voice now carried an unconvincing quality that the entire council seemed to recognize immediately. "Enough," Cale said, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the hall completely. "This council has heard testimony built entirely on second-hand rumor, contradicted directly by simple facts, easily verified through basic investigation. I see no credible evidence supporting these accusations against Alira, and I would ask this council to formally dismiss these charges as unfounded." A long moment of tense silence followed his words, before one of the senior council members finally rose, his expression grave, as he addressed the gathered assembly. "The evidence presented today does appear insufficient to support the severity of these accusations," he said slowly. "I move that these charges be dismissed, pending any further credible evidence that might emerge." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the council, and Alira felt a wave of relief wash over her so powerful that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She caught Cale's eye once more, and this time the relief reflected there matched her own completely, though beneath it, she could still see traces of the anger he clearly felt toward his cousin's failed attempt to destroy her through carefully constructed lies. As the council began to disperse, their earlier suspicion replaced now with something closer to sympathy toward the young woman who had faced such baseless accusations with remarkable composure. Draven remained near the platform, his expression carefully guarded, though Alira could see the barely contained fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He caught her eye briefly before turning away, and something in that final look sent a chill through her entire body, a silent promise that this confrontation, however soundly she had emerged victorious today, was far from truly finished between them. Cale descended from the platform quickly once the hall had mostly cleared, crossing directly to where Alira still stood, relief and lingering tension warring visibly across his features. "You handled that with remarkable courage," he said quietly, once they were close enough that only she could hear his words clearly. "I simply told the truth," Alira said, though her voice trembled slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, the full weight of what she had just endured finally beginning to settle over her properly. "The truth is not always enough against carefully constructed lies," Cale said gently, reaching out to steady her as her legs finally began to shake from the release of tension she had been holding throughout the entire ordeal. "But today, it proved sufficient, thanks to your composure and quick thinking." As he guided her carefully back toward her chamber, Alira could not shake the memory of Draven's parting look, the barely restrained fury that promised this was merely a temporary setback in whatever larger scheme he continued to pursue against both her and Cale. Whatever victory they had achieved today, she understood now with growing certainty. The true danger surrounding this fortress had only just begun to reveal its full and terrible shape. The days following the failed hearing brought an uneasy calm to the fortress, though Alira could sense that the peace was temporary at best, a held breath before some greater storm arrived. Cale visited her each evening as before, But their conversations now carried a new gravity, both of them aware that Draven remained undeterred despite his public humiliation before the council. If anything, his failure seemed only to have sharpened his resolve, pushing him toward more desperate and dangerous measures. One evening, nearly a week after the hearing, Kale arrived at her chamber with an expression more troubled than Alira had seen since the night of the attack along the northern border. He said little as he entered, moving to sit heavily in the chair beside the table, his golden eyes distant with worry. "What has happened?" Alira asked immediately, recognizing the familiar weight of bad news in his silence. "Draven has requested a private audience with several key council members," Kale said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "My sources tell me he intends to propose a formal vote of no confidence in my leadership, using your continued presence within this fortress as evidence that my judgment has become compromised by personal feelings rather than the interests of the pack." Alira felt her stomach twist painfully at this news. "Because of me," she said quietly, guilt washing over her, despite Kale's earlier reassurances that she was not truly the cause of these underlying conflicts. "Because of Draven's ambition," Kale corrected firmly, "which would have found some justification, regardless of whether you were here or not. But yes, your presence provides him with a convenient argument, one that grows more persuasive each time he can point toward my obvious concern for your well-being as evidence of divided loyalty." "Then perhaps," Alira said slowly, forcing herself to voice a thought she had been considering privately for days, "the solution is for me to distance myself from you publicly. If Draven's argument relies on demonstrating that your feelings for me compromise your judgment, then removing that appearance of attachment might weaken his position considerably." Kale's expression darkened immediately at her suggestion. "I will not deny what exists between us, simply to appease Draven's ambitions," he said firmly. "I am not suggesting you deny your true feelings," Alira said gently, though she felt a pang of hurt at even proposing such a distance between them. "Only that perhaps, for a time, until this immediate crisis passes, we might appear more reserved before the council and the wider pack. It would cost us privately, but it might save you politically." Kale was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the impossible choice she had presented. Finally, he sighed heavily, running a hand through his dark hair in a rare display of visible frustration. "I hate that we have been forced into such a position," he admitted. "But you may be right that some public distance could help undermine Draven's argument, at least temporarily." The following days proved to be some of the most difficult since Alira's arrival at the fortress. Kale's visits grew noticeably shorter and more formal, whenever others might be listening nearby, his warmth carefully hidden behind a mask of dutiful correctness that felt like a physical ache every time Alira witnessed it. She understood the necessity, understood that this careful performance served to protect them both from Draven's schemes, but the distance still cut deeply, reminding her painfully of how quickly circumstances could force even the most genuine connection into hiding. It was during one particularly tense week that Draven made his boldest move yet. Alira learned of it not from Kale directly, but from the older woman who continued to bring her meals, her expression grave as she delivered the news in hushed, urgent tones. "Draven has called for an emergency council session," the woman whispered. "He claims to have new evidence. Evidence he says will prove definitively that the Alpha's judgment has been compromised beyond question." Alira's blood ran cold at this news. "What evidence?" she asked urgently. "I do not know the specifics," the woman admitted. "Only that he seems more confident than before, as though he has finally found something substantial enough to support his claims properly this time." When Kale arrived later that evening, his expression confirmed the seriousness of what they now faced. "Draven claims to have obtained a letter," he said grimly. "One, he insists, proves you were sent to this fortress, specifically as a spy, working directly under instructions from human leadership, seeking to undermine our pack from within." "That is impossible," Alira said immediately. "I have written no such letter, received no such instructions. This is fabricated entirely, just as his previous accusations were." "I believe you completely," Kale said, though his expression remained troubled. "But Draven is far more careful this time. He claims the letter was intercepted by loyal guards along the border, allegedly written in your own hand and addressed to contacts within the human settlements." "I cannot even write," Alira reminded him, frustration and fear mingling in her voice. "How could I possibly have authored such a letter?" Draven claims you dictated its contents to an accomplice within the fortress, Kale said heavily. Someone who transcribed your supposed instructions before smuggling the letter beyond our walls. The complexity and audacity of this new fabrication left Alira momentarily speechless, horrified by the lengths Draven seemed willing to go to secure his ambitions. This is madness, she finally managed. There is no accomplice, no letter, nothing of what he claims. How can we possibly defend against such an elaborate lie? Kale's expression grew even more troubled as he considered the question carefully. I do not know yet, he admitted, but I fear this new accusation will prove far more difficult to dismantle than his previous attempts. A physical letter, however fabricated, carries a weight that mere testimony alone did not possess before. They spent hours that evening discussing every possible strategy, every angle from which they might expose this new deception, before it could take hold within the council's mind. But without knowing the specific contents of the alleged letter, without understanding exactly how Draven intended to present his fabricated evidence, formulating an effective defense proved maddeningly difficult. Perhaps, Alira said finally, exhaustion evident in her voice after hours of fruitless planning. The letter itself will contain some flaw, some detail Draven overlooked in his haste to construct this deception. If we can examine it closely enough before the council session, we might find some way to expose its falseness. That may be our only hope, Kale agreed grimly. I will attempt to gain access to this letter before the formal session begins, though Draven will likely guard it carefully until the moment he intends to present it. As the night wore on and Kale finally prepared to leave, the careful public distance they had been maintaining seemed to matter less within the privacy of her chamber. He crossed to where she stood, taking her hands gently in his own, his golden eyes carrying a fierce determination that steadied her own racing fears. Whatever Draven attempts, he said quietly, know that I will not allow his lies to determine your fate, regardless of how convincing his fabricated evidence might appear. I have faced greater challenges than this before, and I do not intend to lose you now to something as base as manufactured deception. I trust you, Alira said softly, and found once again that the words carried complete conviction, despite the danger looming over them both. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that these past weeks with you have meant more to me than I ever expected when I first arrived within these walls, believing myself sacrificed to a monster that never truly existed. Kale's expression softened completely at her words, the careful distance he had maintained during their public interactions, melting away entirely within the privacy of this small stone chamber. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before finally releasing her hands, his reluctance to leave evident in every line of his expression. Rest if you can, he said finally. Tomorrow, we face Draven's latest scheme together, and I promise you, whatever lies he has constructed, the truth will ultimately prevail. After he departed, Alira remained awake long into the night, her mind racing through every possible scenario the coming confrontation might bring. She thought of the letter Draven claimed to possess, wondering what elaborate fiction he had constructed to make his lies appear convincing enough to sway an entire council against her. She thought of Kale's fierce determination and the growing danger that now threatened not just her own safety, but his very position as leader of this fortress and the fragile peace he had worked so hard to maintain. Whatever tomorrow brought, she understood now, with absolute clarity, that the conflict simmering beneath the surface of this fortress had finally reached its breaking point, and that the outcome of the coming confrontation would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the future of the entire pack, and the delicate treaty that kept two nations from returning to the devastating wars of generations past. Dawn had barely broken over the mountain fortress when the sound of shouting and clashing metal shattered the fragile quiet Alira had grown accustomed to during her weeks of confinement. She bolted upright from her bed, heart hammering violently, as the unmistakable sounds of conflict echoed through the stone corridors beyond her chamber door. This was not the hushed argument or careful political maneuvering she had witnessed before. This was something far more dangerous, the clear sounds of an armed confrontation unfolding somewhere within the fortress walls. She rushed to the door, pounding against its heavy wood with both fists, desperate for any information about what was happening. To her surprise, the door swung open almost immediately, revealing not a guard, but the older woman who had brought her meals so faithfully over the past weeks, her expression frantic with fear. You must come with me, the woman said urgently. grabbing Alira's arm and pulling her into the corridor without further explanation. Draven has made his move. He has convinced several of the border guards to join him, and they have stormed the fortress, while most of the loyal warriors were stationed elsewhere on patrol. "Where is Cale?" Alira demanded, fear for him overriding every other concern, as they hurried through the torchlit corridors, the sounds of fighting growing louder with each step. "Fighting to hold the eastern wing," the woman said breathlessly, "but I fear he was already weakened before this attack began. There were whispers this morning that he had been struck by a blade laced with silver during an earlier skirmish, poison that saps our people's strength unlike anything else." The words sent ice through Alira's veins. She had learned enough during her time within these walls to understand the terrible effect silver could have on wolves like Cale, a poison that weakened them far beyond any ordinary wound. "Take me to him," she said firmly, refusing to simply flee to safety while Cale faced such danger alone. The woman hesitated only briefly before nodding, understanding perhaps that trying to argue with Alira's determination would prove futile. They moved quickly through corridors filled with chaos, past wounded guards and the sounds of ongoing combat, until they finally reached a smaller chamber, near the eastern wing, where several loyal warriors stood guard, outside a closed door. Alira pushed past them before anyone could stop her, bursting into the room to find Cale slumped in a chair, his face pale and covered in sweat, a nasty wound along his side that had been hastily bandaged but clearly not properly treated. His golden eyes, usually so sharp and alert, seemed dulled with pain and exhaustion. "Alira," he said weakly, surprise evident even through his obvious suffering. "You should not be here. It is not safe." "Neither is leaving you to suffer without proper care," she said firmly, immediately kneeling beside him to examine the wound more closely. Her mother's teachings came flooding back to her, every lesson about treating poisoned injuries suddenly more valuable than any treasure. "This needs to be cleaned properly, and if silver has entered your system, we need something to help draw it back out before it spreads further." "There is no time," Cale protested weakly, though his body clearly lacked the strength to argue further, as Alira began working with practiced efficiency, calling for clean water and cloth from the startled warriors standing nearby. "There is always time to save your life," Alira said fiercely, her hands steady, despite the fear coursing through her, as she worked to clean the wound, carefully searching for any fragment of silver that might remain embedded within the injury. Her fingers found what she sought after several tense moments, a small sliver of metal that she extracted carefully, watching Cale's face contort with pain, even as visible relief followed almost immediately as the poison's source was removed. "That should help considerably," she said, continuing to clean and properly bandage the wound, while Cale's breathing gradually began to steady, color slowly returning to his previously pale features. "You need rest, but at least now your body can begin healing properly, rather than continuing to fight against the poison spreading through your system." "Thank you," Cale said quietly, gratitude evident in his weakened voice as he studied her with an intensity that spoke of far more than simple appreciation for medical care. "You continue to save me in ways I never expected." Before Alira could respond, one of the warriors stationed near the door burst into the room, his expression urgent. "My lord, Draven's forces are pushing toward the central hall. Without you leading the counterattack, our loyal warriors struggle to maintain their position." Cale attempted to rise immediately, though the effort clearly cost him considerably, his legs wobbling beneath him despite Alira's careful treatment. "I must lead them," he said, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "You can barely stand," Alira said, alarm evident in her voice as she moved to support him. "If you go out there in this condition, you risk collapsing entirely, giving Draven exactly the opportunity he needs to claim victory." "But if I do not go," Cale said grimly, "our loyal warriors may lose heart, believing their leader has already fallen. Sometimes presence alone, however weakened, matters more than perfect strength." Alira understood the terrible logic of his reasoning, even as every instinct within her screamed against allowing him to risk further injury in his current state. "Then, let me help you," she said finally, making a decision that surprised even herself. "I may not be a warrior, but I refuse to simply hide while you face this danger alone." Cale's expression showed immediate alarm at her suggestion, though the desperate circumstances left little room for the argument he clearly wanted to make. "It is far too dangerous," he said firmly. More dangerous than losing everything you have built here to Draven's ambition? Illyra countered fiercely. I have watched you fight for the truth, for peace between our peoples, for weeks now. I will not simply stand aside while that fight reaches its most critical moment. With no time remaining for further argument, and the sounds of battle growing ever closer, Chaol finally relented, allowing Illyra to help support his weakened frame as they moved together toward the central hall, where the fiercest fighting had concentrated. The scene that greeted them upon arrival was chaotic. Loyal warriors struggling valiantly against Draven's forces, the balance of the conflict clearly teetering on a knife's edge. The moment Chaol appeared, even weakened as he was, a visible surge of renewed courage swept through his loyal warriors, their attacks growing more determined and coordinated as word spread that their alpha had not fallen after all. Draven, positioned near the far end of the hall directing his own forces, turned at the commotion, his expression twisting with fury and disbelief at the sight of his cousin still standing, despite the poisoned wound he had clearly believed would incapacitate him completely. This changes nothing, Draven shouted across the hall, though the confidence in his voice had clearly wavered at the unexpected sight before him. Your human girl cannot save you from what is about to happen here. She already has, Chaol called back, his voice growing stronger with each passing moment, despite his obvious weakness, drawing strength perhaps from the desperate need to protect everything he had fought so hard to build. And she will continue standing beside me, long after your ambitions have crumbled to nothing, Draven. The battle that followed raged with an intensity Illyra had never witnessed before. Loyal warriors pushing back against Draven's forces with renewed determination, inspired by their alpha's continued presence, despite his obvious injuries. Illyra found herself pulled into the chaos as well, using whatever skills she possessed to help tend to wounded warriors on both sides, as the conflict continued to unfold around them, refusing to simply stand idle while others fought and suffered. As the tide of battle gradually began shifting in favor of Chaol's loyal forces, Draven's expression grew increasingly desperate, his carefully constructed plans clearly unraveling before his very eyes. In a final act of desperation, he broke from his remaining forces and charged directly toward Chaol, clearly intent on ending this conflict through a direct confrontation rather than accepting the growing likelihood of defeat. Chaol, despite his weakened state, met his cousin's charge with a fierce determination that spoke of years of training and an unwavering resolve to protect everything he held dear. The confrontation between them was brief but intense, and though Chaol's injuries clearly hampered his usual strength, his skill and the fierce motivation of protecting his people and Illyra proved sufficient to finally overcome his cousin's desperate assault. As Draven fell, his forces around him quickly losing heart and beginning to surrender, rather than continue fighting a battle they now clearly recognized as lost. A heavy silence gradually settled over the great hall, broken only by the sounds of wounded warriors and the ragged breathing of those who had survived the intense confrontation. Chaol stood over his fallen cousin, his expression carrying a complex mixture of grief and grim relief that spoke to the painful complexity of the conflict that had finally reached its conclusion. Illyra rushed to his side immediately, concern for his weakened state, overriding every other emotion, as the adrenaline of battle finally began fading from her system. You need proper care, she said urgently, examining him closely, for any further injuries sustained during the confrontation. It is finished, Chaol said quietly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, as he finally allowed himself to lean against her for support. Draven's ambition has cost him everything, but this fortress, this pack, they will finally have the chance to heal from the division he sought to create. As loyal warriors began the careful work of securing the fortress and tending to the wounded on both sides of the conflict, Illyra helped guide Chaol toward proper medical attention, her heart still racing from everything that had unfolded, though beneath the exhaustion and lingering fear, a fragile sense of hope had begun to take root. Whatever challenges still remained in the aftermath of this terrible conflict, she understood now that the true test of loyalty and courage had finally been met, and that the fortress, and the fragile peace it protected, might finally have the chance to move forward without the shadow of Draven's ambition hanging over every decision made within its walls. 3 days passed following the battle within the Great Hall, days filled with careful healing and the slow, steady work of restoring order throughout the fortress. Chaol's wounds, though serious, gradually improved under the careful attention of both Illyra and the fortress healers, his strength returning with each passing day, despite the lingering effects of the silver poison that had nearly claimed his life. Elira remained by his side throughout his recovery, no longer confined to a single chamber, but moving freely through the fortress, as word of her role in the recent conflict spread among the pack. The change in how she was perceived by those around her proved remarkable. Where once guards had averted their eyes and refused to speak with her, now warriors and council members alike approached her with genuine respect, grateful for the courage she had shown in helping tend to the wounded during the battle, and in standing beside their alpha during his moment of greatest vulnerability. The stories of the frightened offering who had transformed into a fierce protector had spread quickly throughout every corner of the fortress. On the fourth morning after the battle, Cale finally felt strong enough to call for a formal gathering of the full council, along with representatives from throughout the pack, to address the events that had unfolded, and to determine the path forward for their people. Elira stood at the edge of the Great Hall, as warriors and council members filed in, taking their places for what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in the fortress's history. Cale rose from his seat at the head of the hall, his posture still carrying some evidence of his recent injuries, though his voice remained strong and clear as he addressed the assembled crowd. What happened within these walls 4 days ago represents the darkest chapter this pack has faced in generations, he began, his golden eyes sweeping across the gathered faces before him. Draven's ambition nearly cost us everything we have worked so hard to build, the fragile peace between our people, and the human settlements that has prevented war for over a decade. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, many faces still showing the strain of recent violence and loss. But this crisis has also revealed something important, Cale continued, his gaze finding Elira where she stood near the edge of the hall. It has shown us the true measure of courage and loyalty, qualities that have nothing to do with the blood that runs through one's veins, or the species one happens to belong to. He gestured for Elira to step forward, and though nervousness fluttered through her chest at the sudden attention of so many eyes turning toward her, she found herself moving forward with a confidence she would never have possessed during those first frightened days locked within the beast's chamber. This woman, Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, arrived at this fortress believing herself sacrificed to a monster, sent here by a treaty designed to prevent the very kind of conflict Draven nearly succeeded in creating. Instead, he continued, reaching out to take her hand as she came to stand beside him, she found not a monster, but a burden I had carried alone for far too long. And rather than succumbing to fear, she chose courage. Rather than remaining silent, she chose truth. And when danger threatened not just her own life, but everything this pack holds dear, she chose to stand and fight rather than flee to safety. Elira felt her heart racing as Cale's words washed over the gathered crowd, understanding the significance of what he was about to say, even before he spoke the words aloud. I could continue to hide what exists between us, Cale said, turning to face her directly now, his golden eyes carrying a warmth and certainty that left no room for doubt, out of fear for what others might think, or concern for how such a bond might be perceived, given the complicated history between our peoples. But I have learned, through everything Draven's ambition nearly cost us, that hiding truth out of fear only creates space for lies and manipulation to flourish. He turned back to address the full council and gathered pack members. I ask this council, and I ask this pack, to formally recognize Elira, not simply as this year's offering, fulfilling an obligation neither of us ever truly chose, but as my chosen mate and future queen of this territory. A stunned silence followed his declaration, quickly giving way to a ripple of surprised murmurs throughout the hall. Elira held her breath, uncertain how such an unprecedented announcement might be received by a pack still reeling from recent violence and division. But then, slowly, one of the senior council members who had witnessed her courage during the false accusations against her weeks earlier, rose from his seat. Given everything this woman has demonstrated, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, her courage during false accusations, her skill in helping tend our wounded during the recent conflict, and her willingness to stand beside our alpha, even when doing so, placed her directly in danger. I see no reason why this council should object to such a union. One by one, other council members and respected warriors throughout the hall voiced similar sentiments, the initial shock giving way gradually to genuine acceptance, and even enthusiasm for the unprecedented alliance being proposed. Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes, as she watched the pack that had once feared and imprisoned her, now embracing her as one of their own, a transformation she never could have imagined possible during those first terrified days locked within the beast's chamber. "There is one more matter this council must address," Chaol said, once the murmurs of approval had settled, his expression growing more serious once again. "The treaty that first brought Illyra to this fortress, the tradition of yearly offerings, meant to appease rumors of a beast that never truly existed, must end. It was born from fear and misunderstanding between our two peoples, perpetuated by stories meant to keep outsiders from discovering truths that needed protecting, for reasons that no longer serve either side." He continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Instead, I propose a new treaty, one built not on fear and sacrifice, but on genuine partnership and mutual understanding between our people and the human settlements. Illyra's presence here, and the courage she has shown throughout this ordeal, has proven that trust between our two peoples is not only possible, but essential for the lasting peace we all desire." The council's response to this proposal proved even more enthusiastic than their acceptance of his personal announcement, many expressing relief that the difficult tradition of yearly offerings, one that had caused pain and fear on both sides of the treaty for generations, might finally come to an end. Plans were quickly set in motion to send emissaries to the human settlements, carrying news of the proposed changes and Chaol's genuine desire to build a more equitable and lasting peace between their peoples. In the weeks that followed, Illyra found herself traveling back to her own village, for the first time since her arrival at the fortress, though this time as an honored guest, rather than a frightened offering being sent to an uncertain fate. Her reunion with her mother, whose health had improved considerably, thanks to proper medical care Chaol had insisted on providing once he learned of her illness, brought tears of joy that Illyra had feared she might never experience again. "I feared I would never see you again," her mother said, embracing her tightly, tears streaming down both their faces as they reunited after weeks of painful separation. "The stories that reached our village spoke only of the terrible beast within the mountain fortress. I never imagined you would return to me, not just alive, but transformed into someone so remarkably strong and confident." "The beast was never real," Illyra explained gently, sharing with her mother the true story of everything that had unfolded since her arrival at the fortress. The discovery that the monster of legend was in truth a burdened king, fighting to protect his people from conflict and treachery, and the unexpected bond that had grown between them despite every obstacle placed in their path. As the formal ceremony announcing the new treaty and Illyra's position as Chaol's chosen mate approached, representatives from both the human settlements and the wolf pack gathered together for the first time in generations, not as adversaries bound by fear and obligation, but as genuine allies building something new together. Illyra stood beside Chaol as the ceremony began, her mother among the honored guests, watching with pride and wonder as her daughter took her place beside the leader who had once been feared as nothing more than a monster in the stories told to frighten children into obedience. From this day forward, Chaol announced to the gathered crowds representing both peoples, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled masses, "The offering that once symbolized fear and sacrifice between our peoples will instead be remembered as the moment true partnership began." Illyra arrived at this fortress believing herself condemned to face a monster. Instead, she discovered truth, courage, and a partnership that I believe will guide our peoples toward a future far brighter than anything the old treaty ever promised. As cheers erupted from the gathered crowd, representing both human settlements and wolf territories united in genuine celebration rather than fearful obligation, Illyra felt Chaol's hand find hers, his golden eyes meeting her own with a warmth and certainty that spoke of everything they had overcome together since that first frightening night when she had been locked within what she believed was a beast's chamber. "Whatever fears brought you here," Chaol said quietly, meant only for her ears amid the celebration surrounding them. "I am endlessly grateful that fate chose you to walk through that door and discover the truth, hidden behind years of fear and misunderstanding." "As am I," Illyra replied softly, her heart full with a happiness she never could have imagined during those first terrified hours, locked within stone walls, believing herself sacrificed to a monster that had never truly existed at all. What she had found instead, beyond every fear and every danger she had faced within that fortress, was a partnership built on genuine courage, understanding, and a love that had grown stronger through every trial they had overcome together. And as the celebration continued long into the evening, marking not just a personal union between two individuals, but the beginning of genuine peace and understanding between two peoples who had lived too long under the shadow of fear and false stories, Elira understood with complete certainty that she had found not the terrible fate she once believed awaited her, but a future filled with purpose, partnership, and a love she would treasure for the rest of her days.